What happened to horror movies being scary? What happened to iconic monsters and terrifying scenarios that stuck with you long after the credits? Jaws made you afraid to go in the ocean, Jason made you afraid to go camping, and Psycho made you lock the door when you were taking a shower. Even movies like Hostel made you more cautious when you were on vacation, and Final Destination made you afraid to drive behind trucks on the freeway. When was the last time a horror movie had that type of impact? What was the last horror movie that actually scared you? And I know there's never been a movie that's universally scary to everyone, but even though I'm not personally afraid of Jaws, Psycho, or The Exorcist, I can still recognize the impact they had on the genre, and that's why we're still talking about how good they were today. We're still remaking, remixing, and reimagining franchises from 20, 30, or even 50 years ago, instead of making original content or even sequels to movies from the past decade. Why do we need an 11th Hellraiser sequel, a 12th Jason movie, or even a 13th Michael Myers film, instead of a third Sinister or maybe an It Follows sequel?
Where they at though?
Something in the genre definitely changed after 2010, and it feels like it was the end of an era, because almost everything after that feels like it's missing something important. Now, this isn't to say that 100% of the movies have been bad, but when you compare the past decade of movies to other decades, there's a noticeable lack of originality, and there's been very few new franchises or recognizable monsters since 2010. Now, some of you might say Hereditary, The Witch, or Get Out disproves the point I'm trying to make, but all those are closer to psychological thrillers than horror. And even though they only came out a few years ago, people are still talking about horror movies from the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s more than anything that came out in this past decade. Now, you can argue that it might be just nostalgia, or maybe modern horror movies haven't had enough time to become classics, but I don't think most people from the 80s or 90s thought horror movies from the 60s and 70s were better. Now, I don't want to sound like some old man talking that back in my day shit, because there's a few movies from the 2010s that I think are genuinely good, but there isn't a consistent enough amount of them, and none of them really address any modern societal fears. So I started to wonder if maybe I had just seen too many horror movies over the years, and I was too old to be afraid of cinematic fear. But just based on the fact that so many people still love horror movies from the past more than they do the modern ones, makes me think that maybe something happened in this last decade in our society, and is being reflected in our horror movies. Horror movies are a manifestation of society's fears, and they offer a window into the mindset of that society and what it's collectively afraid of. This means that the subject matter of a successful horror movie is the direct reflection of the prevailing fears that exist in the society it was made in. This is why so many horror movies from the past or movies from other countries might not be scary to a particular audience. They might not fully understand the type of fear the monster represents, or the concepts might be outdated and culturally irrelevant. This is why someone living in modern-day America might not think Pazuzu, Nosferatu, or even Godzilla is scary because they didn't see them when they originally came out, or they're not a part of the culture where the movies were made in. So if you wanted to know what specific fears a society had from any decade, all you would have to do is watch the most popular horror movies from that time. Of course, you can tell the difference between a 007 or a sci-fi movie from the 60s, but that's only because of the film quality and not because of the stories and themes. James Bond is doing the exact same thing he's always done, and science fiction movies are still focused on aliens and the dangers of technology. But horror movies are different, because the topics and themes change every 5 to 10 years to reflect the fears and concerns of the current society. And the reason why so many remakes of old horror movies fail is because they were popular because when they came out, and not because of the story itself. When we looked at past decades, there was always an overall theme that each era of horror movies followed, and they were always in sync with the concerns, beliefs, and fears of the society at the time. I started to feel like maybe my own feelings about modern horror could be something that everyone else was experiencing too. And maybe it was possible that our modern society had been so safe for so long that we all forgot how to be afraid. Every animal is afraid of obvious dangers, but humans are the only animal that have the luxury of creating imaginary dangers that don't actually exist. Everyone knows that wild animals can be dangerous, and sometimes people do get attacked or even killed. But we rarely think about it happening when we're camping or walking through the park, and instead, we imagine the most improbable things, like a pack of wolves breaking into our houses and eating our families. Fear has been a constant companion since the beginning of time, and when we still lived in small tribes and villages, fear was a necessary survival instinct. It was a smart idea to be afraid of the dark because it was filled with unknown creatures that could easily kill us. But when we transitioned into organized societies with guards standing at the gates, the needs for these type of fears gradually began to fade. With the decline of daily physical dangers, people started to fear more abstract things, like disease, poverty, and mental illness, and these fears took the shapes of supernatural beings. Ghosts and demons were now seen as the personification of these fears, and because they now had a physical form, it made them easier to understand and confront. Horror movies serve as a modern-day version of the myths and scary stories that our ancestors used to cope with their fears and anxieties, and they allow us to deal with our own fears in a safe and controlled environment. But as our modern society has become more desensitized to violence and gore, horror movies are struggling to have the same impact that they once did in the past. With our lives becoming safer and more secure, the fears that once drove us to believe in ghosts and demons are slowly starting to fade away. And this is made painfully obvious with the declining quality of horror movies, which now rely solely on remake nostalgia, jump scares, and cheap gimmicks. When we looked at past decades, there was always an overall theme that each era of horror movies followed, and they were always in sync with the concerns, beliefs, and fears of the society at the time. For example, demonic possession movies were extremely effective in the 60s and 70s because the world was still very religious and many people believed that this was something that was possible. Fast forward to today, and the belief in demons and possession is lower than it's ever been. So even though the modern demonic-focused movies are objectively better in every aspect, they can never have the same effectiveness that they did in a more religious time. Demons are a more era-focused monster that's gradually becoming more irrelevant with time. But if you examine every horror movie this way, you can easily see the deeper fears they're all supposed to represent. The fear of dolls or inanimate objects coming to life, nightmares, sexual assault, the fear of people who live outside of the suburbs and inner cities, or even simple things, like having your home or somewhere that's supposed to be safe violated by something evil. A good zombie story really isn't about the zombies as much as it's about the emotional side of watching the world descend into chaos and being helpless to do anything about it. A zombie is the perfect monster for a modern society because they represent a culture that no longer fears the supernatural as much as it fears having the comforts and conveniences ripped away. Nobody's afraid of demons or monsters anymore, and because everyone is so detached and socially isolated nowadays, the only monsters we're really afraid of are each other. Zombies are basically human nature stripped down to its most primal components, and they represent the fear that our friends, family, or even neighbors can turn against us at any time. It can also be argued that zombies represent the fear of poverty in the lower class, because the primary objective in every zombie movie is to survive by collecting resources and creating a gated community that stops undesirable people from being able to enter. Now oppositely, vampires could represent the fear of the upper class, and not the socially outcasted leathercoat vampires from the 90s. I'm talking about the classic, lacy dress shirt, crushed velvet dinner jacket, erotic millionaires with a castle interpretation. The rich are often seen as selfish, decadent, and willing to take advantage of anyone so they can keep their position in society. And what better representation of that than a vampire? But what about the nun or Annabelle? The bye-bye man or the creeper? Other than the fear of the unknown, or death, which can be applied to every horror movie, what specific or general type of fear do they represent? The most successful horror movies always use the monsters as the personification of things we're afraid of, and the ones that fail don't understand that all fictional stories are allegories, so the meaning has to be greater than the sum of its parts. Just because you have a great monster design, creepy atmosphere, and perfectly timed jump scares doesn't mean anything if the underlying themes don't connect with something deeper in the audience's subconscious. Each category of horror represents a general type of fear, and every monster is the personification of a more specific threat. So what happens when a horror movie doesn't represent a specific type of fear? What happens when a movie monster is just a monster? You get something that I like to call a pastiche horror movie. There's only two different types of real horror movies, monster-focused and survivor-focused, and anything that doesn't fall into one of these two categories is a pastiche horror movie. Pastiche horror is a type of movie that has all the cosmetic characteristics of the genre, but it's only pretending to be something that it doesn't fully understand. It looks and feels familiar because of the music, monsters, and scenarios, but it's only concerned with entertaining you with gimmicks and manipulating you with cinematic tricks and tropes. Horror movies are designed to scare you, but pastiche horror is made to startle you. A jump scare can be an amazing thing if it's executed correctly, but a quick cut to a scary face and a loud sound isn't necessarily scary just because you're responding to being surprised. A jump scare in a horror movie is like tickling someone that's watching a comedy. Laughter and fear are both involuntary responses, so if you have to force someone to react rather than allow them to respond naturally, the thing they're watching isn't truly authentic. You all remember those screamer jump scare videos from back in the early 2000s? Well, this is exactly what pastiche horror movies do. This isn't scary, and this isn't what horror is either. This is a cheap cinematic trick that startles you because it's unexpected. There's a scene in a movie called The Descent that I was absolutely terrified of, and it perfectly represents the most effective way to use horror without needing to rely on cinematic tricks in order to be scary. The Descent is about a group of adventure seekers that go cave crawling in an unknown section of tunnels, and they discover a group of underground dwelling mutants. Now, the creatures didn't necessarily scare me, but I am extremely claustrophobic to the point where I want to be cremated because I can't even handle the idea of being in a box like that even after I'm dead. Now, if you've seen the movie, I'm sure you know what scene I'm talking about, but let's take a look at it because this is what real horror is.
Okay, breathe, slowly. Just keep breathing.
What the fuck am I can't. I'm dying. I can't fucking breathe.
Now, this scene is so effective to me because I can put myself in this situation and, well, I would never actually be in this situation, so there's no possible way this would ever happen to me. I don't care if there's $100 billion inside or if you put a gun to my head, there's nothing you can offer me or threaten me with that would make me crawl in a tunnel like this.
Let me think about that for a second. How about, fuck no.
Now, you might be one of those people that does this for fun, so you see this scene as exciting, but
boy, ain't no way, boy. Hey, boy, ain't no fucking way, boy. Boy, ain't no way, boy.
The point I'm making is that this scene didn't need a loud noise or a monster to scare me, because real horror is a visceral experience that can't be manufactured or forced. Pastiche horror is what happens when a filmmaker either doesn't understand how to use cinema as a way to address the deeper fears that we have, or it's intentionally made to take advantage of the type of audience that's only interested in cinematic fast food. Now, this is typically referred to as a popcorn flick because its only goal is to keep you distracted for 90 minutes, but it doesn't have anything important to say. Now, this doesn't mean that every movie has to have some deep philosophical observation woven into the story, but horror movies have to either focus on the monsters or the survivors, and pastiche horror movies don't focus on either. When you think about horror movies, you probably think about monster-focused horror first. This type of movie focuses on the monster as the protagonist, and it's never meant to truly be scary because the point is to show off how many interesting ways the monster can kill people. Monster-focused movies humanize the villains. They have names and backstories, and you really don't care who the victims are because you probably want the monster to kill them. Some examples are Saw, Hellraiser, Friday the 13th, or Candyman. You can tell a monster-focused movie when the name of the monster is in the title, and most of the time the monster is the only character that's in all of the movies. Now, you would never go see a Jason movie where he didn't kill any campers, or a Ring movie where no one watches the tape, because you don't go to see monster-focused movies because of the characters. You go so you can see how many interesting ways the monster can kill people. Now, this is different than a pastiche horror movie because even though they're both made to entertain you more than scare you, a monster-focused movie uses the monster to represent things you're afraid of, and it allows you to face these fears in a fun and cathartic way. A survivor-focused movie is the complete opposite of monster-focused, and they almost never give much explanation or personal details about the monster because the focus is on the impact the situation is having on the survivors. In this type of movie, the monsters have to lack humanity, and their objectives are usually unknown or never really addressed. This is basically any movie with killer animals, creatures, or something ambiguous that never shows up on screen. These types of movies treat the monsters like outsiders, and we never understand their motivations or see anything from their perspective. Some examples are Jaws, The Thing, The Ruins, or even The Shining. With all those, the monster can be switched to almost anything because the response to the threat is all that matters. Think about any zombie movie and replace the zombies with rats or aliens or radioactive alligators, or replace Jaws with a killer octopus. Does it really change the story? However, just because there's an ambiguous monster doesn't automatically make it survivor-focused. There still has to be some conflict with the survivors, and the monster has to represent a general fear or a stressful situation that they have to deal with. Think about Paranormal Activity versus the original Blair Witch Project. They're both similar found footage movies, but with the Blair Witch, there's an obvious conflict between the characters, and the witch really doesn't matter because the movie could easily be about 3 people that get lost in the woods, and they're panicking because they're running out of supplies. The monster could even be a bear or a mountain lion or anything really, and the movie would basically be the same. But on the other side, Paranormal Activity has an ambiguous monster too, but there's no conflict between the characters. There really is no focus on the monster or the survivors, so the entire point of the movie is to use jump scares and gimmicks to be entertaining. The Mist is another great example of survivor-focused horror. The basic plot is about a group of people stuck in a grocery store after creatures from another dimension take over the town. We only get a small hint about where the creatures came from, but it never really matters because their only purpose in the story is to be the catalyst for the drama that takes place inside of the store. So it wouldn't matter if they were dinosaurs or zombies or even just poisonous fog, because the story would basically be the same. Now let's look at a monster-focused movie. The Saw franchise started off relatively simple. A man that's dying of cancer decides to put people in death traps so they can have a greater appreciation for life if they can survive. The later films ended up overcomplicating everything with a bunch of secret apprentices and convoluted motivations, but every movie was just a group of people stuck in a warehouse and most of them getting killed by the traps. Just like Jason, Pinhead, or even Freddy, the only reason you watch the movies is because you wanted to see how many interesting ways the traps can kill people. Saw is completely dependent on Kramer and the traps, and it's the only real thing that matters in the franchise. So if you changed any aspect of either, the movie would be completely different. But what about something like Sinister? At first you might think it's monster focused because we know Bagul's name and his backstory, but strangely enough, the story wouldn't be much different if it was Freddy, Pennywise, or even the Babadook. The first hour was horror movie perfection, but when it crossed over into the third act, it switched from being survivor to monster focused, and the story was never able to recover. This is one of the reasons why the sequel was so terrible. The filmmakers didn't know if they wanted to keep the focus on Ellison and leave the ending ambiguous, or if they wanted it to be a supernatural slasher that could be turned into a franchise. In a lot of ways, it felt like a sequel to The Shining at first. A struggling writer moves into a new place and he starts seeing supernatural things, and we never really know if the place is actually haunted or if it's just the person losing their mind. Sinister started off on that path, but the third act felt like a completely different movie. Bagul should have just stayed in the shadows as more of a representation of Ellison's desperation for success, the same way the ghost in The Shining can be seen as a representation of Jack's alcoholism. Ellison wanted to have another successful book more than anything, and we can see him gradually losing his mind trying to create this elaborate urban legend. So a man creating a story, writing a book about it, and killing his family to authenticate it is sinister. There wasn't a need for an external monster at the end, and the decision to make Bagul the focus of the story was the thing that ruined the franchise. Now that you understand the two different types of horror movies, what type of movie is it follows? Does it focus on the monster or the survivors? Could the monster be switched to something else and not change the story? And is there any meaningful conflict between the characters? Now, I don't want to just pick on that movie, but it's a great representation of what's wrong with the past decade of horror movies. After looking at multiple lists of the top 100 best horror movies from the 2010s, I feel like this is one of the worst decades for horror because all the movies people would consider to be good are either psychological thrillers masquerading as horror, or pastiche horror that depends on gimmicks with no real memorable moments or characters. The internet is definitely another reason why horror movies have dropped in effectiveness over the past decade. Having access to so much information makes the world feel smaller and less mysterious, and it's difficult to use the fear of the unknown when there's very few things we don't know. There's an obvious suspension of disbelief with every horror movie, but in 1977, many people probably believed there might be a small town in Texas with a chainsaw-wielding cannibal. Now everybody knows this isn't real today because you can directly talk to people online who live in Texas and they'll tell you it isn't real. It's also pretty difficult to ignore technology's impact on how we consume and perceive media today. There's so many easily accessible options for entertainment, and it encourages creators to prioritize quantity over quality. So many horror movies end up being corporate products and not an artist creating something from their imagination. This is why Hollywood keeps cranking out the same bullshit every year, and why they don't care about making meaningful films as much as they care about making formulaic franchises that can generate money with minimal effort or creativity. This is similar to what happened in the 80s with VHS movies. Before that, everyone had to go to the movie theater to see a film, but all of a sudden, the direct-to-video market opened up a lower-budget world of cinematic possibilities. This is one of the reasons why you see so many slasher films in the 80s, because it was cheap and easy to just put a mask on a guy, give him a knife, and have him chase people around for 90 minutes. This is also why we still love 80s horror movies. They're almost always low budget and made by people who wanted to create something entertaining and original. Horror is the only genre that's actually better when it doesn't have a massive budget, A-list actors, or a well-known director. So there's really no benefit to having a big studio in charge of a horror movie because the best ones come from filmmakers who have less money and more creative freedom. Now, going back to the idea of movies representing society's fears, I think it's strange that we don't see more horror movies that focus on technology. We're at the point where science fiction movies could start to be seen as horror, because something like Blade Runner or The Matrix seemed almost impossible in 1999, but 25 years later, we're on the verge of living in a virtual world and creating artificial intelligence. Shows like Black Mirror or movies like Ex Machina are what modern horror movies should be, but maybe this isn't something we're actually afraid of yet, and it's the reason why most technology-based horror movies never explore the concept on a deep enough level. Now, I imagine technology will be the focus of more horror movies in the next few decades, but for now, we're stuck with the horror genre that's still trying to figure out the fears and concerns of the society we live in. Each era of horror focuses on a specific type of fear, but when I examined the 2010s, it was the only era that I really couldn't find a central theme for. Not having a central focus is one of the reasons why modern horror feels so empty and pointless, but the lack of connecting with society's current fears is what I want to focus on next. Each decade is extremely complicated, and it will probably take an hour to fully dissect and analyze each one, so I'm primarily going to be addressing what I feel are the most important themes and fears from each era, so you can see how modern horror movies have failed. Very few horror movies were made during this time, and much like the 90s, most of these films are actually psychological thrillers. Everything else is just pastiche horror, imitating the themes and visuals, but never meeting the criteria of the genre. There isn't a central theme or an emphasis on any specific type of fear, as much as the films from this era represent the general attitude of the decade. So much of our modern entertainment is failing because it's catering to a female audience, but it's doing it in a way that doesn't actually attempt to entertain anyone, because it's more concerned with trying to send a message. Now, if I had to pick a theme, I'm torn between grief horror, failed remakes, and post-horror. Grief horror is when the characters are drowning in sadness and misery, but where horror movies typically focus on the emotional side of dealing with the problem as it happens. Grief horror focuses on what happens after the tragedy is already passed. Movies like The Witch, Hereditary, or The Babadook don't actually have an antagonist, and instead, the emotions of the characters are supposed to be the enemy. Like I said before, this is a very female-centered approach to horror because women often use victimhood as a social currency. But that doesn't translate well to a genre that's supposed to be focused on rejecting victimhood and overcoming fear. The Evil Dead is so loved because it was basically a student film that didn't have any of the creative limitations that studios usually put on a filmmaker. So even though the remake made money on nostalgia and gore alone, it didn't have the same significance that the original had in the 80s. Other films like Carrie, Pet Sematary, Child's Play, or even Elm Street all tried to ride the nostalgia train too, but they failed to have any impact on a modern audience because they didn't understand that the themes in the originals were outdated and no longer relevant. Now, there's also the issue of why these movies were made in the first place. There's a very simple rule when remaking a film. You can't remake movies that people still like. Now, the one exception is if the remake is going to add some necessary improvements to the story, like with Dawn of the Dead, The Fly, It, or even The Thing. All of those improve the original story because of the updated visuals and cinematography. But those are exceptions, because the best remakes are almost always original films that no one really cared about. Unlike the 2000s remakes, the 2010s thought they could just copy old movies and make easy money. Nothing new was added, no improvements were made, and they picked films because they were popular in the past, and not because they thought the themes and stories would resonate with a modern audience. Post-horror is basically an artsy, experimental subgenre that advertises itself as horror, but instead of trying to scare the audience, it focuses on existential themes and social commentary. This is like Get Out, It Follows, The Devil's Candy, Bone Tomahawk, It Comes at Night, or even Under the Skin. In a lot of ways, post-horror tried to redefine the genre, but it was too heavy-handed with the social commentary and never really tried to scare the audience. As I said in the beginning, I don't think these movies are bad by any means, but the problem is that horror movies from this era don't seem to have any relevant themes like the eras from the past. Now, this is the best decade for horror movies. Period. It's not debatable, it's not even close. 2000 to 2010 is where horror movies peaked, and I don't think there will ever be another period like this in my lifetime. Camera quality and special effects both took a big leap forward in this era. So much like color in the 20s, audio in the 30s, and the practical makeup advancements of the 80s, the 2000s added CGI, cinematography, and creative freedom to the mix, and it resulted in the perfect blend of everything that makes a horror movie great. The internet was still in its infancy of this decade, but it allowed us to experience horror movies from all over the world, and it also allowed us to share information and ideas with each other through homemade films in an early version of social media. Now, this gave us an appetite for unedited, lower quality found footage content, and because we were able to see unfiltered violence and death online, we also developed a desire for uncomfortable realism, and this gave birth to the torture porn subgenre. This is like Saw, Hostel, Wrong Turn, 13 Ghosts, Martyrs, High Tension, and the amazing remakes of Texas Chainsaw and Hills Have Eyes. I actually think remakes made during this time were way better than the originals. The modern film quality, cinematography, and focus on more cinematic gore and violence gave them the upgrade that they desperately needed. The 80s were able to create some very convincing gross practical effects, but they were almost always used on monsters and aliens. But in the 2000s, those effects were almost always used on the human body. This is also the era where the modern zombie was born. The early 2000s saw a spike in many different contagious diseases, and this is why zombies were no longer reanimated corpses rising from the grave, but infected humans that turned into hyper-aggressive killing machines. Foreign horror was also very popular during this time. And like I said before, it was mostly due to the internet giving everyone access to other cultures and entertainment So movies like The Grudge, The Ring, Pulse, and Battle Royale could not only be enjoyed in their original form, but they were also remade for a Western audience. The 90s were a strange decade for horror because instead of addressing our fears, the films focused on the cultural shifts from consumerism, bright colors, and excesses of the 80s to the rebellious, gritty societal angst of the 90s. Big hair metal was replaced by grunge, positive hip-hop was replaced by gangster rap, and the established villains from the past were given a 90s makeover to reflect this rebellious attitude. Because of the countless played-out sequels and irrelevant 80s horror themes, Generation X got its own unique type of boogeyman, the intelligent psychopath. And because this was the primary theme of this era, it can be argued that most horror movies from the 90s are actually psychological crime thrillers. This is like Seven, Silence of the Lambs, Candyman, and even Misery. This is also the decade that gave birth to the 24-hour news cycle, so it felt like serial killers and criminals were more popular than ever before. Violence and death were always present in our society, but this is the first time the general population got to see the more sensationalized who, what, and why details of a crime scene. In the past, criminals were always portrayed as degenerate, deviant, and despicable, but the criminals in 90s horror movies were presented as pop culture figures to be idolized. They were simultaneously charming, defiant, and cutthroat, and much more complicated than simply a slasher with his mask off. I Know What You Did Last Summer and Scream are typically given credit for saving the horror genre, but both of these franchises are closer to parody mystery thrillers than horror. Now, I'm glad they brought mainstream attention back to the genre, but the bad part is that it showed Hollywood they can make money from formulaic psychological thrillers that were only pretending to be horror movies. The same people that filled up the theaters to go see these types of movies every year are the same type that keep going to see the Conjuring and Paranormal Activity sequels. Studios realize that these types of movies are cheap and easy to make, and instead of focusing on creating compelling stories or developed characters, they dumb down the writing so the movies can focus on a sensory experience. This is why the jump scare became such a big part of horror movies after the 90s, because most people don't care if the story makes sense or not, they mostly just want to turn off their brains and be entertained by pastiche horror. This era was mostly about the commercially appealing franchise slasher, putting an 80s paint job on the classic monsters from the past and updating them for a new generation. Because the 80s were a pretty safe decade to be alive, the horror movies mostly centered around the fear of bad things violating places that are supposed to be safe. Jason terrorized a summer camp, Freddy invaded your dreams, and Poltergeist haunted a family in a suburban home. This era of horror also saw the rise in films that dealt with the unknown, like Hellraiser, The Thing, or even Alien. The average person knew more about the world than ever before, so our imaginations allowed us to travel to places that were unexplored, like space and other dimensions. Over the previous decades, horror movies managed to terrify the audiences through subtlety and moderation, but just like everything else in the 80s, these horror movies took the opposite approach and made everything as grotesque and over the top as possible. The most noticeable thing about 80s horror movies is the nauseating practical effects. Technical advancements in animatronics and prosthetic makeup meant that the human body could be distorted to grotesque new dimensions on screen. Now, this could just be seen as nothing more than the visual effects catching up to the imaginations of the filmmakers, but body horror was actually addressing the panic surrounding the emergence of AIDS and other STDs, and this can be seen in films like The Fly, The Thing, or even Aliens. Because the 60s were a decade of rebelling against the traditions of the past and focusing on self-gratification over responsibility, the 70s were a decade of dealing with the consequences of so many things in society changing so quickly. The horror films of this era primarily focused on three things. With the rise of the sexual revolution and the creation of the birth control pill, sex can be enjoyed without the risk of pregnancy. The 70s were the first decade where pregnancy could not only be controlled, but no-fault divorce and women entering the workforce en masse made children the direct antagonist to a lifestyle of freedom and self-pursuits. These fears can be seen in films like The Brood, Eraserhead, It's Alive, and Demon Seed. Religious vulnerability was also a focus because many people felt like they would be punished for abandoning the religious traditions of the past, and this can be seen in films like The Exorcist, The Omen, Rosemary's Baby, and Suspiria. This theme kind of straddles two different eras because the majority of the religious-focused films were made in the late 60s and early 70s, but the films of the 60s were more focused on cults more than religious fear. The 70s also highlighted how terrified we were of leaving the safety of the suburbs with movies like Texas Chainsaw, The Hills Have Eyes, The Wicker Man, and Cannibal Holocaust. These films all showed how sheltered and xenophobic society really was, and the growing lack of trust everyone had for people that were different than they were. The 1960s were primarily defined by a cultural revolution, where the generation gap between the traditional social stability of the 50s and the uncertainty of the 60s was wider than any two generations before or after. This decade saw everything from the end of segregation, women's lib, the Cold War, Vietnam, the sexual revolution, and political assassination. The modern audiences have become immune to silly-looking aliens and giant radioactive monsters of the 50s, and they now wanted horror that was more rooted in reality. They wanted something more believable, something more sophisticated. They wanted films that dealt with the issues that directly represented the world they were living in. So rather than focusing on external threats, society started to re-examine its own psyche and behaviors, and for the first time, it realized that the worst monster of all was humanity. The fear and distrust of other people was obvious in Psycho, Rosemary's Baby, and Village of the Damned. And as I mentioned before, zombies are basically human nature stripped down to its most primal components, and they represent the fear that our friends, family, or even neighbors can turn against us at any time. The political and social changes of this era were also on full display, because this is the first time we see a cross-dressing villain, a black protagonist in a horror film, and this is also the first era to empower female characters and make them more than just a damsel in distress. After surviving the horrors of World War I, society wasn't afraid of costume monsters and fictional villages anymore. They were no longer trying to escape, and they wanted stories that more closely represented the everyday reality of Cold War tension. The main fear of this era was of the atomic bomb and being invaded by a foreign enemy. These fears were addressed by a wave of disaster movies, where aliens and giant monsters took the place of foreign invaders and atomic bombs. If you watch the destruction scenes from War of the Worlds, Attack of the 50-Foot Woman, or Godzilla, you'll notice the parallels between these movies and the destructive nature of an atomic bomb. Godzilla stomps on buildings and destroys cities the same way an atomic bomb would, and films like Them, The Blob, or even The Thing all represent foreign invaders attacking civilians just like an occupying army would. By today's standards, these films are closer to science fiction and horror, but the theme was clear. Society was concerned about being invaded or killed by bombs. I think the 40s were objectively the worst decade for horror movies because it was flooded with a wave of sequels, remakes, spin-offs, and crossovers, telling the same tired old universal monster stories and trying to create a cinematic universe that required little imagination. Because of the success of the universal monsters, movie studios were focused on profits over creativity, and there was the additional obstacle of censorship that made creating impactful horror movies almost impossible. Now, some may argue that this era did have a meaningful theme, but it definitely didn't reflect the most important societal issues like World War II or the threat of nuclear war. If anything, I would say mutants and mad scientists were the most common theme of this era, but the reason it's largely forgotten is because it's sandwiched in between two eras that had a far bigger impact on the genre and society. The 1930s were probably the most difficult decade to be alive in the past century, and because the Great Depression was destroying so many people's lives, this is when cinema crossed the threshold into being a legitimate form of escapism. Unlike the realistic characters and problems of the previous eras, 30s horror movies were more like exotic fairy tales inspired by the literary classics of the 1800s. So instead of focusing on the internal struggles that mirror real-life situations, these films took place in exotic locations with costume characters and strange accents. Both the technical and artistic sides of filmmaking improved dramatically as well, and because movies were no longer silent, they were able to use sound to enhance the horror experience like never before. This era was dominated by the classic universal monsters, and even though they didn't directly reflect the hardships of the time, the supernatural monsters and fictional locations represented a society that was trying to escape the everyday realities of the Great Depression. The biggest issue in the 1920s was society trying to cope with the after effects of World War I, and more specifically, the soldiers that came back who were dealing with both physical and psychological scars. Horror movies from this era mostly focused on sympathetic villains who felt rejected by society, and because of their physical appearance, they were forced to become the embodiment of their inner trauma, causing them to lash out and seek revenge on a world that they could never be a part of. Phantom of the Opera, Hunchback of Notre Dame, The Man Who Laughs, and Nosferatu all feature physically deformed villains who live in isolation that are forced to interact with a world that doesn't accept or understand them.